vehicles. Um, this webinar will be on new mobility, automated vehicles, and real estate. Today's program, we're going to welcome you all and introduce the COE. Professor Josh Ma, who's director of the COE, will do that. Before I, Juan Matute, program manager of the COE and deputy director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UCLA, introduce the webinar and the panelists. We're going to have time for your questions of the panelists today. And so in order to take those questions, I encourage you all to use the Zoom Q&A feature. And so that is at the bottom bar of your Zoom window. And with that, Joshi.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Again, my name is Josh Ma. I am the director of the Center of Excellence on New Mobility and Automated Vehicles, for short, Mobility COE. So if it's your first time joining us of this webinar series, or the first time you are hearing about the Mobility COE, so I would like to give you a quick introduction about Mobility COE. In October 2023, the Federal Highway Administration entered into a cooperative agreement with UCLA and our partners, including CMU, National Renewable Energy Lab, and Real SAMC Share Use Mobility Center, University of Alabama, and Metro Lab networks to establish this Mobility COE as defined in a bipartisan infrastructure law. So the purpose of the Mobility COE is to collect, conduct, fund research on impacts of new mobility, highly automated vehicles, when they are deployed at scale. At scale is really our focus in this Center of Excellence. So our focus areas is quite broad, in fact. It includes land use, urban design, transportation system, real estate, equity, and municipal budgets. So if you can see on the slides, so we are aiming ourselves to be a hub of a lot of domain expertise in research and practice. We conduct a best practice, we collect best practices and perform applied research. But more important, as part of it, we'll do it through extensive engagement with our stakeholders in local governments, state governments, and so on. So collaboration is really a core of our center. As you can see on the right side, these are some detailed introduction of focus areas. And if you can see the slides, actually, you may switch to a different screen sharing of UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. You'll be able to see the slides. It's focused on land use and design. Real estate is one area, which is the topic of today's webinar. We also focus on how to fund these new mobility systems, how municipal budgets will look like when these are deployed at scale. We also look in at engineering systems, system safety, looking at, we kind of go beyond the functional safety a little bit, but we want to looking at the operational safety, the systems safety approach type of analysis to understand when this new mobility, highly automated vehicles integrate into transportation, what it will look like. And the list goes on. We'll look at multimodal systems, looking at the transportation mobility as a service. We will looking at different mobility data strategies, how to sharing data, what data are needed today, evaluating safety, evaluating efficiency of these systems. We're looking at equitable use, access, impact of these new mobility systems. We're looking at economics and governance of new mobility solutions. And last but not least, pathway design outreach. Again, partnerships, collaboration is at the center of our mobility COE. So this webinar, I just want to quickly mention that is our third webinar in our webinar series, and the previous two have been recorded and posted on our website. If you're interested, please take a look. And this webinar occurs bi-monthly, each focusing one of these actually subtopics of this listed focus here. So, and information about our each webinar and potential, we will host some future workshops will be announced on our website, LinkedIn page, and distributed via our mailing list. So please subscribe to our mail list via our website. and our staff will put our website here. And you also will be able to receive these updates through our LinkedIn page. And this is the code that you can scan and go to our website directly to subscribe for Mobility COE. All right, today, so I'm so excited that we have very esteemed 4 panelists. One will introduce them in a minute. So we'll focus this very unique topic. I don't think it's discussed quite a lot in academia and industry, but it's very important that we want to bring it up front into our mobility series. This is the relationships between the highly automated vehicles or autonomous vehicles, if you will, right? A more futuristic term, new mobility solutions and land use and real estate. So, and we will hear from them, they're real estate experts, academic experts, about how this new mobility automated vehicles is being transformed, is transforming our system, is being integrated into our buildings and campuses. I guess we'll talk about parking, we'll talk about importance of different types of development strategies, and even curb management and so on. Okay, just thank you again for joining us. I will pass it to Juan. Juan will introduce our panelists, and Juan, please take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Joshi. And so I wanted to provide some context for how transportation technologies have shaped real estate and urban development over time. Being at the University of California at Los Angeles, Los Angeles is a case study of ours. And so I wanted to share the story of Los Angeles, where 2 transportation technologies have helped to transform the region and fuel real estate development and opportunities. The first technology was interurban railways and streetcars. So prior to that, people got around on horses and horse-drawn omnibuses. But then interurban railways and streetcars created this opportunity to have a mass transportation system. And that fueled residential decentralization in Los Angeles, creating the urban structure and regional form that we have now. In the 1920s, there was the proliferation of automobiles, a new technology which didn't need rails and could bring mobility off the rails. And so in the 1920s and beyond, real estate growth in Los Angeles was fueled by the opportunities created by mobility with automobiles. So this is a look at what's now the Hollywood sign, but started as a sign to advertise real estate opportunities in Hollywood to bring more of the Southern California and Los Angeles residents out of the urban area and to what was then the more rural, suburban, bucolic area of Hollywood. And that was enabled by this automobiles. And so that's what's happened in the past. Today, we're going to be talking about the future and what new mobility and automated vehicles will mean could mean for real estate. And so today I'm joined by panelists Mark Arizmendi, who is a steering committee member for our Center of Excellence and founder and CEO of Northwestern Capital Partners, LLC. Jonah Suskind, who's the co-director of research at the PREX Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is focused on environmental problems caused by urbanization. Nico Larco, professor of architecture and environment and director of the Urbanism Next Center at the University of Oregon. And slightly later today, we'll be joined by Terry Shook, real estate developer working on a biotechnology campus, among other projects in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Yeah, one of his colleagues is also already on the line, and we'll fill in for Terry while we wait for him.
Oh, okay. So I believe that is Henry Stepp. Is that correct?
Right. That is correct.
Okay. So Henry Stepp works with Terry and is here for now. And so I wanted to invite each of you to start by maybe giving a 3-minute overview on how do you think that automated vehicles and new mobilities will shape the future of real estate and land use. So just out of the gate, what are your initial thoughts and impressions? We'll have lots of follow-up. Let's start with Nico.
Great. Thanks so much for the invitation. Very happy to be here. So I have to say the first question really is a question of deployment. So how it's going to impact the future of real estate and land use? Well, it really depends on what deployment looks like. So how widespread is this? Is this only in central cities or outside of central cities, which is both a logistics question, but just as much, maybe more importantly, a business question, a business model question. What's the cost going to be? Are these things going to be cheap? Is everyone going to be able to use them? Or is it going to be is it going to kind of be what like Uber and Lyft are right now, which would be much more limited? Are they going to be privately owned or not, shared? What are the uptake rates? So a huge number of caveats with that. So I'm going to talk for the purpose, and I'll say that I've got questions on how much of what that is all going to look like. But if we assume this idea that they're going to be widespread and affordable, which are big assumptions, but let's just assume that, what kinds of impacts are going to have. So two of the big ones that we really look at is one of them is the expansion of the metropolitan footprint. Those examples you showed of LA, one of the corollaries to all that is how much land became, developable. There's something called the Marchetti's constant, which says more or less that throughout history, we've always kind of, urban agglomerations have always existed around this idea of how long it takes you to move, how far you can go in half an hour. So we could only walk, developments were no bigger than half an hour's worth of walking. All of a sudden we had horses, that gets larger, as we have first streetcars and then cars, that gets larger. And, right now, the average amount of time that we spend commuting in this country is about 27 minutes. So somewhat consistent there. So the question is, could this change that? Well, it could change it in two really big ways. On the one hand, in theory, AVs should be more efficient, especially on freeways and arterials. And therefore, we could actually go further. And the other thing is that, well, it might actually, for the first time, kind of disrupt Marchetti's constant, because we're not necessarily going to be, having to sit there and do the transportation as our act. The car's going to be driving, and I could be doing other things. I could be napping, eating, watching a movie, doing work, whatever. So maybe instead of like half an hour, I'm willing to do 35, 40 minutes, which means that if we want cheaper land, or we want to be closer to natural areas, we might be willing to go further out. So it could drastically put pretty big pressures on sprawl, which has all sorts of ramifications we can talk about. So that's one, I think, really big impact. The other really big impact that we look at a whole lot is this question of reduction in parking. Again, caveat with if it's widespread, if it's cheap, if most people are using it, there's a lot of uptake. But if those things happen, in theory, we need a lot less parking than what we have right now. Now, there's a lot of variables. We did some work with this, a report we did recently, doing some work for Waymo, looking at doing kind of a little bit of a meta-analysis of all these pieces. There's a lot of potential reductions in parking, but that has a lot of caveats on how it would happen, if conditions necessary for that to happen. If it was to happen, there's all of a sudden, for everyone who's in real estate knows, tons of opportunities for development. How do we redevelop the land that exists, that's currently parking? How that would reduce the cost of development. We don't have to carry the cost of parking or the cost of land for that parking. We can build more densely. Obviously, parking is oftentimes the limitation for how dense housing can be, all these types of things. So maybe I'll stop there and can add more later on, but those are two of the main things that we look at.
All right.
Maybe can I piggyback off that? Because I think,
Sure.
I think one of the ways that we tend to, there's a lot of alignments in the way that, at PREX Lab at MIT, some of the ways that we're thinking about the potentials for reconfiguring the metropolitan footprint, which I think, to Nico's point, there are so many questions. There are more questions than answers. And a lot of the questions have to do with the degree to which that metropolitan footprint may be expanded, vis-a-vis the kinds of opportunities that Nico is pointing out here in terms of how user adoption works, and the ways in which this sort of emergent transportation technology can be connected to other forms of everyday life. I would also say that one of the things we like to study and think about and ask questions about, and try and answer to the extent that we can, is not just about the size of the footprint, but is about the morphology of that footprint. So traditionally, Los Angeles is actually not the greatest example, but traditionally most American cities and really most sort of Western cities more broadly that have been influenced by the vehicle and the sort of automobile since the turn of the 20th century have evolved sort of in this very sort of centralized, expanding from the center sort of morphology. And what we are beginning to see already because of changes in terms of work from home, some of the things that the pandemic has accentuated and accelerated in terms of lifestyle that do have direct ramifications on both real estate and land use, very aggressively in some cases, is urban morphology and suburban morphology as well. So, you know, going from a kind of monocentric to a polycentric urban form has incredible ramifications in terms of how people are using transportation and how mobility comes in as both a sort of service offering and also potentially a way of sort of rethinking our relationships to public transportation, mass transit, and some of the curves and sort of social and economic structures that have been deeply ingrained in our way of getting around and sort of the ways, the sort of feedback loops between how we move, how we get from where we live to where we work, but also, you know, how we sort of think about the opportunities for leveraging the co-benefits of new forms of mobility around the metropolitan footprint more broadly. So I think yeah, not just how big does the footprint seep into the hinterlands or into rural areas or peri-urban areas, but also how do new smaller centers and the kind of polycentric morphology of urban space in general affect or feed back into this feedback loop of mobility more broadly. And I think that's a really important place for us to be looking as well.
And Mark, what are you seeing?
Well, the same things. And so I do want to kind of bring up one thing, which is kind of the urban use. And we have a colleague that's on the phone or on the call with us, Martin Leitner, with Perkins and Will, that brought up the idea of blur cities, that, you know, the kind of typology of what cities are going to look like will change, you know, that there will be a greater dispersion and keep in context of that 20 to 30 minute city. We may not have to drive to a central location every time. My kind of thought on this is more economic in nature. I started out in real estate development in Los Angeles for a number of years, and then became an investment banker. I invested in a company that was sold to Robert Bosch about, I think it was 2017. And the thing that compelled me at that point was on land use, how we drive, and then kind of this coming, recalibration of real estate and land use that we've seen is the idea that even if a car had the ability to park itself completely autonomously, level 4, that would be meaningful. Not just has to be on the streets, but that if you were able to drop off a car and it could park itself, never open its doors, find the parking spot, and do some of those really important things, you're going to lower parking footprint by 20% no matter what. And that's for cars that have this software enabled. So you're not going to see 20% across the board, but it's a really good starting point. And, you can call it a bridge to the future or whatever, but that exists today. And that was inherently very interesting from a real estate perspective, especially when you're paying $80,000 to construct a podium parking structure, $80,000 per space. The other thing is that as we got into that, we started working with Toyota on the OEM side and others as well. And CBRE, which is the world's largest real estate firm, say, okay, now if we go approach this together, what can we do to make a meaningful difference in this period of high interest rates, more expensive land, supply chain disruption, which happens, it's a real thing. And we started talking about the use of fractional use cars. And so we actually have 4 of these going live within the next month or two. And the idea is that we were working with municipalities. For example, one we're doing with Henry's team, Henry Stepp, is if we were working with a big, presumptively with a big healthcare institution in Charlotte that otherwise couldn't build these projects because the parking was too expensive. And it's from a apartment building, kind of workforce housing right to the campus, this medical school campus. And we were able to trade off roughly between 50 to 60% of the parking requirement by having fractional use vehicles. That's, again, projected to save the developer about $23 million, and it brings a project to life in a dense urban core that otherwise would likely not get built. And for us, it was really important because it created workforce housing and lowered the cost of owning a car. And for the developer, it created a amenity and asset attractiveness that wouldn't otherwise be there and save them money on their capital expenditures. So, our view has been decidedly on the economics of real estate. And we think this is a great thing because it's not just about the economics of real estate, but, it provides, a platform to reduce CO2 emissions, both embedded and non-embedded carbon, and other issues that we think are societally important, as well as creating value with the hope that the tax rolls will increase by these new developments so you have a new $400 million development that otherwise wouldn't get built and is now paying taxes, which supports the community. So that's really our effort. And so we have tried to take a very tactile approach to it. And we are actually, like I said, we're going live with these projects now. And we think that's a really important thing because somebody has to start out.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing two things that can happen at the same time, but would have perhaps competing effects on real estate values, or just, each pulling things in different directions. One is that the move to new mobility and automated vehicles can make parking more efficient in infill urban areas, reduce building costs, and potentially unlock additional supply in those areas. But two, with the perhaps changes, or not necessarily changes, but in Marchetti's constant, you may have these dispersal effects where people don't mind being located in places that are far from traditional urban centers. So my question that I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into is, how would the widespread, so we can have the assumption of widespread adoption of highly automated vehicles impact real estate values and development patterns? So it may be, core, periphery, preferred area, and non-preferred areas. Like, you can categorize where you think it will increase, decrease values. Anyone want to try that one first? Nico?
I can jump in.
Go ahead. Please go.
Or go ahead if you'd like. I started the last one, so go ahead, Mark.
Well, so we did a study with CoStar, and it was interesting because, we talk about real estate values, and yes, on the CapEx side, that's a great thing, right? You're going to save money up front, and the numbers we're talking about are very significant, because I was giving you those net of the cost of mobility, that if the landlord is, supporting the fleet of cars for their tenants or anything else, or their presumptive users, that's a net savings, and that's a really good thing. And that money can be redeployed if the tenant is not, leasing a car for $1,000 a month all in, but is doing it for $300 or $400. It means that they have money to spend elsewhere, and consequently, we think that's a really good idea. From the amenity side, if it can keep a building more full, there's an economic ramification for that, right? Occupancy is everything right now, and amenities are tied directly to your occupancy, not just daily occupancy, but your occupancy rate. The other thing is that this study showed that a mobility-enabled building, not just on rail, not TOD, but an MOD, is creating about 17% more net operating income than a building that is not so enhanced. So for a landlord, there's every incentive to do this. And the other thing that we're working on now is a cap rate survey. And, if you look at a cap rate is similar to a capital asset pricing model, and there's a risk component in that, if we're eliminating some of the downstream stranded asset risk of a parking structure, we think that will have some effect on stabilizing cap rates over the long term. We think there's a heck of a lot of good economic arguments to have this autonomy in place.
Great points. Nico?
Yeah, so a couple things. So first of all, I just want to say again, this is a large caveat of this widespread adoption. And the thing that I want to talk about is the biggest caveat is the business models of these things, which I think still need to get figured out. I mean, no one tells you right now, no company will tell you what they see as the target cost of a trip, right? Not to mention the price of a trip. And so that is and does it work in downtown San Francisco? Does it work in downtown Houston? Does it work in the suburbs of Houston? Does it work in the exurbs of Houston, right? The further you get from the center, the harder it is to see these things really working. So I just want to like make sure that everyone understands that's a big caveat. In terms, if it was widespread adoption, I think there's one of the things to think about in terms of real estate value. And you asked the question of like, where will value go up or go down? I mean, one thing to think about is both these trends that we talked about initially of reduction in the need for parking and expansion of the metropolitan footprint. And I love Jonah's addition of what the morphologies of these things. I think it's super interesting, and we should talk about more. But both those things, that expanding metropolitan footprint, no more parking, is increasing the amount of land that's available for development. So if you think about parking as a competing land use, right, we're reducing that, potentially. I'm not going to say to zero, but up to like 50%, let's say. That's all that land is now available for development. In dense urban cores that don't have a lot of land specifically used for parking, there might be more parking in structures and things. Maybe not as much of an impact. In suburban areas, enormous impact, right? Enormous impact as addition of land. And then if you look at the history of every time that there's been an innovation in transportation, what happens? Land values in the core go down. Land values in periphery go up, right? That's like everything moves out a little bit. So you could see that if you happen to be like a landowner, or someone who owns farms out at the edge of a metropolitan area, this could all of a sudden increase land values tremendously out there, moderated again by the slightly in from you questions of how much parking now is available for development. If you're within the central core, it's possible these things could depress land values, right? Because you're like, shifting development further out. So I think there's these kind of like these macro changes based on land availability that we should be thinking about as well.
Yeah. I really like shifting the focus out to the sort of suburban fringes and starting to think about how those land values might change. I think on a more micro scale, there's a lot of feedback loops related to those land values as well. When we start working with developers who are having to negotiate between the trade-offs between, say, getting the most environmental performance out of a development versus the most, maximizing the development footprint itself and being able to generate the most revenue and ensure ROI. Those things are always at odds with one another. And so that's a relatively easy example for us to think about in terms of negotiating trade-offs. One of the things that a full adoption or a sort of widespread adoption allows us to imagine are product types that come into the suburban market that are radically different from housing products that have existed in the past. And we've been working with developers to, even just experiment with what happens when we remove the garage from the suburban house in Texas, which, is sort of has been unthinkable until very recently, where we started to be able to show that allows developers to increase density, increase ROI, work with builders to develop new products that have not yet been on the market, and really start to think about how property values might be able to shift actually in service of affordable housing as well. Really thinking, we've been working with developers that are really focused on sort of missing middle kind of housing, how to embed that into suburban sort of archetypes where some of that has been really challenging in the past. The capacities for changing the morphology and the sort of configuration of suburban blocks, where we start thinking about the amount of space that is currently embedded in driveways, on-street parking, sort of formal traditional setbacks and garages, that ends up being about 40% of a typical American suburban block. And if we say that we're opening up 40% of space for new uses, those things could be in service of greening and carbon sequestration and stormwater management with more vegetation, shade, mitigating some of the urban heat island effect. But those things could also have a lot of impact in terms of the amount of housing that goes on offer. And what we've come to understand through our models is that those things no longer have to be mutually exclusive with this caveat or this sort of hypothetical scenario of mass adoption. So that also becomes really significant.
I just want to hit one point that you hit on really well, which is the stuff that we're working on is workforce housing to a great degree. So I agree, it makes workforce housing possible, what we're doing.
That's right.
And I think that's really important because it's definitely bringing people that are driving in, for example, at the project I referred to about this big hospital system in the medical school, is a lot of these kind of support have to drive in from 30 to 45 minutes away. Now this puts them within a 5 to 10 minute walk, shuttle ride, whatever it is. And so, without them having to give up a car that they only use 45% of the time anyway. So I think it's definitely a reallocation of resources and asset intensity that did not exist before this technology comes into place.
But if I can add some things as well. So one of the things that Mark just mentioned, the cars are right now, most cars are used 5% of the time, right? So 95% of the times our cars are just idle, which means you'd see enormous reductions in the overall fleet needed, right? So we think about an Uber model where one car is now, serving many of us. Let's say it's getting like 50% utilization rates, right? That's an enormous increase compared to the 5% rates that we're seeing right now. So the overall number of cars to serve the same number of people is reduced drastically. So that again, we're big shifts happening overall in the economy with that. I also just want to mention some other competing land uses that might actually be interesting if we make this whole hard shift. Again, caveat, if we make this whole hard shift. But if we think about things like mechanics, gas stations, auto parts store, car lots, all these things might actually no longer, especially if we go to an Uber-like model, the robo-taxi model, these things will largely go away, right? And these things do take their competing land uses that exist out there right now. Some of these things, car lots are important tax bases and also take up a lot of space. You could have large swaths of these things, eliminated. So lots of getting it back. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say.
You go. Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say lots of cascading impacts from these things, not only the specific things of vehicles. Sorry, go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
So, it's interesting because what you brought up is again, economically, kind of in line with our thesis on this too, which is we know that car sales are down somewhere between 3 to 4% this year. So what you're seeing is inventory piling up on lots that's very expensive for the car dealers to hold. And while you're right, the long term may be different. Right now, especially with Toyota that we're working on, is that if we are commandeering fleets for use in the private sector, for the real estate sector, what ends up happening is it liberates that space from the kind of overcrowding on their car lots. And so again, it's just a better asset intensity. And I think that what you said is very resonant and definitely part of our value proposition too. It's not just for real estate as it relates to the tenants, and the developer. It's also a better allocation of real estate for the dealers and others that that modulate between an empty lot and an overly packed lot and trying to find overflow space. So again, it's about efficiency.
Yeah, it's totally about efficiency. And I think maybe just to sort of play this roll up one more time to Nico's point about these competing land uses and their footprint, I would also add that even if the future does not hold a tremendous reduction in terms of overall footprint of these competing land uses, it likely does hold a reconfiguration of those competing land uses and a redistribution of where those things sit within the urban fabric. Right now, there's such a prominence, we can sort of think about the moving out from an urban core to a traditional suburban sort of land use pattern. That kind of car-based urbanism that we've seen in the past that has sort of prioritized the speeds and geometries and material requirements of the 20th century automobile have also had a tremendous effect on how land use works as an instrument for urban growth, for sort of seeding urban growth and urban configuration. And when we start to imagine the 20th century version of exclusionary zoning, which comes very much out of the legacy of the car, with the assumption that households will want to be aggregated together. So there's these large contiguous swaths of residential zoning that the assumption there is that people will get in their vehicles and go to these large contiguous swaths of commercial zoning and these large contiguous swaths of employment zoning and that the daily household trip is the de facto assumption underlying all of that land use planning to begin with. what we started to see with some of the modeling that we've done is that when we start to include larger and larger, more and more robust assumptions about user adoption of autonomous mobility and also micromobility, which I think is an incredibly important part of the paradigm shift that is underway more broadly, what we see is that there are incredible opportunities for disaggregating some of those land uses and actually atomizing land use planning to a really, really considerable degree. I think there's so much lip service paid to the 15-minute city and the 30-minute commute shed, and this idea of sort of transportation-oriented design or mobility-oriented design. What we start to see when we disaggregate large contiguous swaths of single exclusionary land uses is the real ability to make even suburban kind of configurations much more heterogeneous, which allows for even those competing land uses to be less competitive. So I think that's an important way of approaching these ideas as well.
Okay. Oh, I wanna shift us to, we've been at the 40,000 foot or regional level. I want to shift us down to the 9 by 20 level. From UCLA, we think a lot about parking. And so, Mark, you've made great points about parking as a potentially stranded asset, especially when it's in, structures, subterranean, part of the urban fabric. I think parking lots are more flexible than parking structures. I want to talk about design, management, operation of existing parking facilities. So, it's mentioned that they could get smaller. The individual spots could get smaller and free up to 20% of space. You may need less of it. I know in Los Angeles, I did a past study in 2015, an inventory of parking, and there's like 4 spaces per vehicle out there, off-street spaces. And so that's a lot of asset. And what do you think will become of that in urban and suburban areas, these parking assets? Let's start. Mark, do you want to start it?
I just want to go to one thing that Jonah was mentioning about kind of, the suburbs and, going out. So, and the potential traffic mitigation of having fractional use, mobility and cars that park themselves. We're through a family holding, we're trying to in California, in Camarillo, try to get organized around a 116-acre parcel that is currently a lemon ranch, and it's supposed to be turned into something that is zoned differently. And the prospect of getting that approved is about 8 years. A lot of it is going to be because of pushback on the infrastructure that is not there to support the intended reuse. So I think that what we're talking about is incredibly valuable for the suburban as well as the urban core. That project, it would be much easier to get approved if potential community members thought that this was not going to be a blight of big parking lots and choked side streets and arterials. Otherwise, this project, even after 8 or 10 years, may never get approved. And so what does that matter? Yeah, it's great to have these lemon ranches and beautiful areas, but in terms of the city itself, having a tax base, increasing the tax base for community use is a really good thing. It's a great thing. And it's low intensity development, but still the tax base goes up. It supports schools and other things. That is a great thing. But I think a lot of what we're talking about today in terms of asset intensity and use also creates, again, as I'm just going to refer back to what Jonah said about green space and other things like that I think are so vital to a new development and community infrastructure and support. So I just wanted to add that because I'm completely in line and sort of living through it at the moment. So
yeah. And I mean, the question is ultimately about how do we retrofit, the incredible amount of infrastructure that's already devoted to parking, and what are some of the opportunities for that kind of a sort of design process, or a kind of a strategic reuse from a planning perspective as well. I mean, anecdotally, just back from Brisbane, Australia last week, where Alan and I were looking at some of the development that's happening, where one of the questions is is about what to do with these oversized podiums and these kind of larger buildings, these like 30-story apartment buildings that have had traditionally most of the parking in the building podium itself. One of the opportunities that we are sort of exploring right now as a retrofit is a very, like you said, this is like getting down to the 9x20 here, is especially in hotter climates that we know are projected to become even hotter and make things like micromobility adoption even more challenging. Is these sort of last mile opportunities for embedding micromobility corridors into the podium of these buildings, especially in these super blocks where those structures are large enough and contiguous enough that we could start to imagine mobility corridors being diverted off the right of way itself into the footprint of these oversized podiums that had previously been used for parking. So that's that's an idea. It's one of many kind of examples of, I think, how continuing to use these spaces that have been dedicated for the sort of beginning and termination of a trip to use some of those spaces more actively to kind of encourage new forms of mobility that might not require the automobile at all. I think that's where there's some really great opportunities for thinking a bit outside of our box.
So retrofitting plus 15s for micromobility.
Yeah,
that's an interesting concept. Nico?
Yeah, so we looked squarely at this question. We did a study with Waymo and with Eco Northwest. What we did is we looked at the entire area of San Francisco, looked at all the existing surface parking that exists in the area, categorized that, and said, okay, let's assume that we have a reduction of 20, 40, 60, 80% of parking demand. What might likely happen to this land? So looking at things like what are what might fit on that land? Would it get to a point? So we did a kind of market analysis, real estate analysis, saying, would the land be redeveloped? Would someone add to this land, right? So I've got a strip mall and now I can put an extra box in here, or would I just tear the whole thing down? So very much exactly looking at the question you're asking. What we found was we looked at 3 different sites within San Francisco. What we found was that the sites that are, we'll say, less auto dominant, which there's a lot of that in San Francisco, the effects were really marginal at best. There's a whole lot of other things that decide should an area be developed, why would it be developed, and so we're not seeing a lot of effect. In the one area that we look at that was more auto dominated is where we started to see more impacts, which kind of points to well, all right, that's San Francisco, the core, the city of San Francisco, right? So much denser. We look at more auto dominated areas, you might actually see much more effects happening here, right? This land that you'd either have redevelopment happening or you'd have additional development happening in these spaces. Again, the caveat is, can we, at 20 and 40% reductions, we were not seeing a whole lot of changes happen. When you get to the larger numbers is when you start to see the change happening. And those larger numbers also come with a whole lot of need for, again, as I was saying before, that business model really needs to work out. You need to have a whole lot of other controls, demand management controls that get people to decide that this is a better way of moving. You have to make sure that there's shared vehicles, right? There's a whole list of things that need to happen to make that happen. So it kind of in a breaking point right now, we'll say. One other thing I think that's really interesting to think about is if we get rid of all this parking, right? If all of a sudden we don't need this parking, we still need this transfer moment of me getting out of a car or me getting out, right? Or me getting into a car. And so what we've done is we've shifted, all the transfer that happens right now in a parking lot, which is really diffuse and slow and easy, right? To either happening on the curb. So especially in urban areas, curbside management is going to be way more important, or happening, off street. So now instead of having to design a parking garage or a parking, area, I'm gonna have to design my pickup and drop off area. And, in some places, in suburban areas, I don't think that's that much of a big deal because there's just less density, so less kind of need for that transfer to happen quickly. But in urban areas, you could see a whole lot of impact, right? Like, how is that happening? Especially that's where I think that the impacts in dense urban areas will be larger. Now, instead of people, getting in and out from their car, however as they do right now, they've got to do that on the street, and there could be a whole lot of demand for that curb management.
Okay. Mark, any thoughts specific to the parking management
Well,
for
first,
structured
I
parking primarily.
want to talk about one thing Nico said, which is right. I mean, the stuff that we're working on right now with these fractional use and autonomous parking will require a pickup and drop off zone. Which is more square footage. The caveat is they're reducing parking footprint by 50%. So it's, you've got to find that trade-off. There's an economic trade-off there, but again, I think that, for safety reasons and for, kind of ease of entry, and if the car can go find its own space, for example, that trade-off for parking and drop-off zone is relatively small relative to the potential footprint savings. So, but again, it's got to make sense economically. We're starting to see that in some design areas. I know he's on the call, my friend Martin Leitner, who is, I know that he's been involved with designs that do the same thing, right? That have, pick up and drop off areas. And I think that can be a bridge that can be crossed if you are able to reduce parking to an amount sufficient to make that an easy transition. And from what we've seen on the projects that we're working on now, a 50% decrease in parking, let's say at 350 square feet each, is greatly much larger than a pickup and drop off zone that may be 1,000 square feet. So again, I think that there's ways to get around that, and I think that they are coming very quickly. I also think just on the management side of it, which I think is really important, with CBRE, we're working on these adjudication apps that Nico was referring to, which is how do you get people to use them? How do you kind of modulate the traffic and the use of these vehicles? And, we would definitely integrate first and last mile into that. The important thing in my view, with respect to that is that there's got to be a lot of optionality there and a sufficient, kind of plan to ensure that anybody that wants to make use of a fractional use vehicle and or other transit modalities that you have on site, you've got to make sure that works. And so I think that will take some digital infrastructure that we're working on now.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It might also be important to just point out that this transition to autonomous vehicles is actually sort of secondary from a timeline perspective to the transition to electric vehicles. And these sort of structured parking scenarios will also produce, inevitably these power centers, right? I mean, we're talking about an incredible amount of battery storage in some of these places that are quite central to, especially in the higher density areas. And, it's not something that we've explored a whole lot in our lab, but it does seem sort of ripe for opportunity in terms of thinking about resilience in the kind of energy sector, localized energy grids, some of the challenges that we've been facing more and more in terms of energy sovereignty and security that might tie into this conversation from both a planning and design standpoint. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some interesting opportunities coming out of that nexus as well.
Yeah, so you could have a new type of real estate power center.
That's right. The old parking garage is a real estate power center.
If I can make one more comment real quick.
Sure.
I think this is really interesting question. Again, there's the things we can imagine, and then there's like, okay, how do we actually get to those things? And one of the issues that we've seen a whole lot of difficulty with is this question of off-street pickup and drop off. The companies, right? A lot of the AV companies right now are very reluctant to be doing off-street pickup and drop off. On the one hand, for liability reasons, and also it's a mapping question, right? So it's one thing to map all the streets, and then it's another thing to map everyone's parking lots. And so we've been working with a couple of different companies in different pilots around the country, and this becomes a really, it's great for me to be able to get dropped off anywhere, but if anywhere is, like I've got to walk through a parking lot to get to the entrance of that hospital, right, or walk through a parking lot to get to the entrance of that grocery store, it's not great for the user, right, and would have all sorts of barriers. So is this surmountable? Absolutely, right? I mean, you can absolutely map all the parking lots and all the pickup and drop off areas. That's not going to happen tomorrow, right? I mean, mapping all the streets isn't going to happen tomorrow, but that's not going to happen the day after tomorrow either, right? Like there's a jump. Just to say that there is these friction points that for us to get to this point where the things that we can't imagine would happen.
So Nico, that's a great example of a key consideration for integrating automated vehicles into existing urban and suburban environments. Do you have maybe one or two others before I shift to Jonah and then Q&A?
Trying to think. I mean, we talked a lot about these issues. Generally, in urban environments, I think they're going to be harder to integrate. I think the pickup and drop off stuff is going to be much more complicated. I would love at some point to talk a little bit about this question of congestion, which I think is a large question, because AVs will increase congestion substantially, which will have all sorts of cascading impacts. But in suburban areas, my sense is there would be much easier, right? There's a lot less constraints, a lot more space. Pickup and drop off is not such a big issue. So my sense is it's going to be easier to happen in those areas than in urban areas.
Okay. And Jonah, in greenfields, I think one of the key things, and Mark has mentioned it, is getting local planning interests, planning power structures to see a future that's based in new forms of mobility and automated vehicles. Aside from kind of like communicating that vision, what do you see as the key constraints and opportunities for integrating new mobility into greenfield developments in the future?
I mean, I think from where I sit, I think this really is the most exciting prospect. Just as somebody that has a background in landscape architecture and urban planning, the opportunities for embedding. I mean, I think, greenfield development has notoriously been some of the most environmentally wasteful and redundant kinds of development. And we know that it's sort of the apotheosis of car-based urbanism. I mean, greenfield development has tended to be largely developed outside of the context of public transit, right? Which sort of makes it stand out as this most sort of indelible kind of form of car-based urbanism. I think that form stands to gain a lot and I think it stands to be changed and modified considerably through the adoption of autonomous vehicles. I talked already a little bit about the reconfiguration of suburban blocks, the potential reduction of redundancies in terms of on-street parking, in terms of driveways and garages. I talked already a little bit about the sort of atomization of land use that stands to potentially bring a lot more heterogeneity into the suburban context. But I think, I think above and beyond all of that, there is this real opportunity for, as a researcher, both sort of trying to anticipate, but also observing the ways in which this transition to autonomous mobility will change user behavior outside of transit and mobility, and that sort of in terms of how the structures of daily life in these sort of suburban communities is transformed. And I think maybe the most significant opportunity, as I see it, is the ability to take on the housing affordability crisis in this country. I think that is, when we start to understand how that affordability crisis has been so linked to land use planning, which has been inextricably linked to the automobile, we really, as we start to disentangle those relationships, there are so many opportunities for thinking about new housing types, new ways of controlling land use, and new ways of controlling land value, both from a policy perspective, but also from a pure sort of use and behavior perspective. And then one of the last things I'll say about policy is we've actually made incredible inroads working with municipalities and municipal planning agencies in some of what I think we would typically think of as the sort of staunchest car-based communities and economies in Central Texas, where one of the challenges for developers has been the sort of statutory and regulatory frameworks within which they are beholden. So it's not just code, but it's things like connectivity ratios. The way in which we measure connectivity has been typically only through measuring links and nodes relative to car-based trips. So developers have had no incentive to include micromobility or sort of last mile thinking into their suburban development plans. And so we've begun actually trying to model what it would look like to to develop new forms of connectivity ratios that actually could embed different trip models, both for autonomous vehicles and also for micromobility working together, and really have seen an incredible difference in terms of the overall morphology, the affordance of green space, better access to recreational amenities, better access overall to commercial amenities, which not only allow which are not only because of a shift to autonomous vehicles, but they really are because of a shift away from vehicular dependency altogether. So I think that's something that I just want to stress as well.
Okay. And I'm going to go to the audience questions in a moment. Just as a reminder, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a button that says Q&A. There's 6 questions loaded up there. You don't have to ask a question, but if you like somebody else's, you can click the thumbs up, and that'll let me know that it's a popular question, or you can ask a question. So I'm going to go to that after I ask Mark. What are some key considerations that you think that building owners and managers should be thinking about today and preparing for the future?
Well, I would say a couple of things. I want to go back to something that Nico mentioned, was the drop off and loading zones within a building. I think that'll be really important. We're looking at a couple of things with our colleagues at Bosch, which are that the infrastructure drives the car. The car's not driving itself. And so we think that's really important. If the next step is to have a car in a drop-off area that goes and finds its spot, it may not have been driven autonomously to the building, but once you're there, it is autonomous. And we think that's a really good next step because it's fully level 4. I think the other thing, and I think it's really important, is the economic rationale in a dense urban area where land use is expensive. Hey, Terry, where land use is expensive, there is a direct correlation to how much space you save with parking and the return on investment, which we think is really obviously very important, and the ability to command higher rents. And we think that those issues are vital, and that in terms of thinking of the design in the future, I would say, again, we're working with Terry on a number of projects that are probably close to 1 million square feet that he has incorporated into his design, and we think that that's really an important thing to be forward-looking and plan for the future, reduce parking footprint. I think the big holdback as developers that we're working with are starting to fully embrace this, as they look at opportunities to save money and create better returns. The banks and financial institutions, not so much. I mean, most of them have this formulaic idea of, well, gosh, 3 per thousand, parking ratio, and that doesn't work anymore. So I think that you kind of have to do this. The developer buys in, the financier has to buy in too, and I think that those are kind of the important things to consider.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we work with those kind of things every day, so we see that happening all the time.
Right. Well, welcome, Terry. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to shift us into Q&A now. Terry Shook is the founding partner and principal of Shook Kelly, and may have some perspectives on some of these questions that we have from the audience. And I want to start with one that is addressing one of the gaps we've had in our conversation. So we'd focus a lot on residences, passenger travel, a little bit of retail, workspaces. We have a question from David Kuhn about the impact on land use and real estate with goods movement. And he gives the example, will people sit in a drive-through if they can get delivery? So what's going to be the larger impact on retail in land use? Well, what may be the larger impact? What are folks seeing here?
I mean, I think autonomous delivery systems are nascent, but they're already sort of thriving in some respects, and they are we're already seeing the impacts of these systems on communities and on traffic patterns, and on congestion. So it's not a benign question at all. It's a really significant piece of this puzzle, and it will continue to become more so. I think when we start thinking about passenger passenger vehicles, we have a pretty strong sense of what guides adoption, and a lot of that has to do with user preferences that we understand socially quite well. There's a whole different set of factors that will and are already guiding the way in which parcel delivery works, simply from a kind of a dispatch to destination standpoint. And I think with more autonomy and more, this will be a major issue. One of the ways in which we've begun modeling potential scenarios in more suburban frameworks has been to understand the capacity for localized mobile dispatch centers. We haven't seen a whole lot of this yet, but we know that both Walmart and Amazon are already sort of exploring some of these ideas, where basically there's a truck which could be driven or autonomous, and then that truck sort of dispatches, that truck drives to a central location and then dispatches either drones or robotic delivery sort of services into a neighborhood, capturing a lot of the sort of potentially stranded assets or potentially very congested assets, depending on what part of the urban continuum you live. These would things like the sidewalk, the bike lane, parts of the right of way that in some communities are very underutilized and in others require a lot more sensitivity. So I think, again, this is one of those questions that will have dramatically different answers depending on where you're focused, and where those delivery services are being planned for.
So,
And I think you could
add to that, on the development side, what Jenna said is right on the money. You're going to see different development typologies for distribution. You still have the big, large Prologis type massive distribution centers, but you're going to see these smaller integrated distribution centers in the urban core. And we'll go back to these stranded assets, these buildings and parking lots that are being underutilized. Well, that presents a new development opportunity. So speaking strictly from the development side, not on anything else, again, you're going to see, kind of capital move to its best place. And I think that will be one of them. Smaller micro distribution, which will really play well into the autonomous delivery side.
And I think when you think of commercial delivery, you have to you think of, there's three main categories that you think of, right? One of them is long haul, kind of like trucking. Another one is like more like the localized business to business, and then there's the like direct to consumer kind of parcel delivery. Those have really different needs, and as you get closer and closer to the individual consumers, it gets more and more complicated to make it work in terms of the logistics of making it work, like the actual, like how do you get it? But then also the business model becomes much harder. I think long haul delivery, oh my God, I'm in shock that it hasn't happened yet, that it hasn't like shifted over to autonomy, because that's the one that seems like it has the most sense, right? These are like standard, like the same environment. We have the freeway, like similar conditions. We don't have as many conflicts. Difficulty is that we're going really, really fast, which is a huge, huge problem. But it seems like, oh my goodness, yes, that seems like there's a business model that could absolutely work and is the least complicated. As we get to these other pieces, it becomes much harder to see autonomy having more and more of an impact. The having an autonomous truck deliver, the supplies I need in my restaurant. Well, who's going to take it off the truck? And who's going to check that that's actually my thing, not somebody else's thing? And who's going to like make sure that there's someone there at the time that, there's all these pieces that a human driver actually does all these other tasks that make it more complicated to make these things happen. With deliveries, there's really interesting things happening with drone delivery. We've done a couple of pilots. We've done a lot of pilots, worked on a lot of pilots on terrestrial drones. Aerial drones are a whole nother issue. But, there's a lot of complications of, how long does it take to move that thing? How will the person actually, are they showering and are they going to take another 20 minutes to come down and pick this thing up? And then, how long does my drone need to stay there? Delivery to lockers seems to work really well. And that, actually studies coming out of MIT show that is the one that business model wise and efficiency wise make the most amount of sense. Deliveries to consumers, much harder. And then, you talk about the last first and last mile. Well, with delivery, it's the first and last, 20 feet. How do I go from the driveway, to the front porch? That is a complicated piece. So So I feel like we're going to be seeing impacts on the commercial side, on the delivery side. With autonomy, we're going to be seeing a lot more impacts on the long haul, which I think has less effects probably on the real estate market than these other pieces, which I think will be much, much further down the line.
Mark or Terry, any thoughts on goods delivery and retail?
It's so funny. For the longest time, I taught a course on urban planning around retail at Harvard, and I have determined in my own world that with the new world and post-COVID, that I didn't really have anything else to share, so I suspended the class. That's how new I think this world is, and how and how evolving. So really, that's all I really have to say. I will say this though: I think there are other matters about how we live in our urban environments, because that's what we're talking about, not necessarily, South Dakota, that can impact this, that's in this space. So maybe we'll get to some of those questions in a moment.
Okay. All right. So we have another question. We've talked a lot about maybe the rosy picture of CAVs, where we've had caveats about congestion. We've kind of assumed it away. So what if there's a lot of congestion that comes from connected and automated vehicles, and we're actually kind of like doubling down and increasing travel times for many people to get between places within a region? How what would be your perspective on that future, and how it would affect real estate and people's travel?
I'll jump in if no one else does. I think this is an enormous caveat to the AV future, an AV robotaxi future, right? Because I mean, so if we look at robotaxis, it is the same model as Uber and Lyft. So we know what the impacts are. We'll say I'm going to say AVs might be a little bit better than that, because hopefully they'll be able to do a little bit smarter routing and such. But generally, we know what that is, and it's pretty clear. Studies all over the country, by a bunch of different people, have shown that the Uber and Lyft increase congestion, right? And the big issue is the empty vehicle miles traveled. So I'm going to drive myself to work. I bike, by the way, but if I was going to drive myself to work, my car's sitting right here. I go to work, I park it right next to me. That's it. That the whole trip is part of the utility of the trip. The useful part of the trip is the entire trip. If I call an Uber to do that same trip, the Uber right now is driving around, just like burning up vehicle miles. I call it, it comes over to my house, so it has to travel to me, empty vehicle miles. I get in, I go to where I need to go, the useful part of the trip, and then it needs to reposition itself. Once again, empty vehicle miles. And that difference can be on the order of 100 to 100, the Schaller study, 180% increase in vehicle miles traveled. Mm-hmm. That is a lot of congestion. Studies by Fair and Peers showed that the biggest contributor of congestion increases in San Francisco after Uber and Lyft came was Uber and Lyft. And so the question, if we have a robo-taxi model of autonomy, that is a huge friction point for how it is that rolls out. And my sense is that would be that would be a huge barrier for autonomous vehicles to really take off. I mean, if it turns out people who are in legacy vehicles are stuck in traffic and they're surrounded by 4 cars that don't have anyone in them, there'll be legislation that then changes how that all works.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And our issue has been more focused on the ability for cars to be level 4 and park themselves, and to create this automobile sharing and link it to first and last mile, because our focus has really been completely on land use. And while, yes, roads take up real estate and land, that's the public right of way for the most part, we're focused on the private right of way and how we reduce that impact. And if we can do that, then we think that we're successful. And so I would have to say that I'm taking definitely a much more secular micro approach to it. I think because we're really focused on land use at the end node, not on the street. And we think though that by offering our fractional fleets that we're going live with these next month in several locations. And as Terry knows, we're working on about 10 million square feet of space So, we're looking at a pretty big footprint, over the next year. I think that from our perspective is that we are hyper-focused on the end destination, creating it more efficiently, more humanistic, less focused on parking, and more on community space, office space, or retail or multifamily space. So I would say, that for me, we haven't given a lot of thought to what it's going to do for traffic yet. We think that having fractional use will have some impact on that. It'll make itself easier to carpool, we believe. But in the meantime, having the first and last mile integrated with that will hopefully, again, take these single-use 5-minute car trips out of the lexicon of the leased space. So that's what we're really looking at. So definitely, I'm not looking at as big pictures like as Waymo or things like Nico is doing, but certainly we think that what we're doing will have an important impact, and again, could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars of savings for some of the developments we're looking at right now in the aggregate.
Let me add a couple to that, Mark, because and again, I apologize to everyone getting here late. I was on another call I couldn't get off of. But one thing, an observation about for the big systems thinking folks on the call, which I understand and really marveled by it. But there's a great urban planner back in the day, William White, who that we studied when we were in school. And, basically William White used to make the point that when you're doing master plans, say for large cities and campuses, you probably shouldn't lay down the sidewalks. Let people first walk, and then you figure out the patterns where people walk. Then you put down the sidewalks. And I think there's logic in that in terms of when we engage in big systems thinking human behavior is going to follow precisely the logic that comes through higher level, higher ordered thinking. And that's why I agree with Mark. That's why we're trying to deal with those people who are trying to walk across the fields now, so we can learn to lay down where sidewalks might want to go, or roads, or flying taxis, or whatever the hell comes next.
So I think
that's such an important frame. Like William White's, I love coming back to William White. Somehow we always end up back at William White, but what we have today is we're not just at the precipice of the autonomous vehicle revolution. We're very much at the precipice of a much more highly integrated model of choice. So it's just no longer a field that we have to watch people walk across now, or a plaza, whatever it is. I think what we need to anticipate here is and work towards are different options for speeds, different options for distances, and different options for sort of transport sharing. And those are all things that are already coming online in a lot of different ways. I mean, even just seeing the degree to which the e-bike has proliferated in the past 5 or 10 years, and the range on these things now is so much greater that, again, I think congestion is an extremely challenging issue, and will be one of the most important constraints on how the market and how the industry around autonomous vehicles moves forward. But having more choice for smaller vehicles that can take those 5-mile, 7-mile, even 12-mile trips out of the equation really expands our ability to sort of plan and design the urban fabric accordingly.
Well, I agree with you, and I can give you a real life experience of that, which is more in line in the William White than the top down. Is that I am both designer and developer, the first one in Charlotte, for an apartment building that had 0 parking.
Nice.
0 parking, 87 units was the first one. And we said, no parking there, but we have 5 Teslas that are accessed through an Envoy app. And we're leasing these units to younglings who are very much, urban types, and they're right on the light rail line in Charlotte, et cetera, et cetera. Well, our model was proven, but here's what we found out after a year and a half. First, they didn't like the Teslas. They didn't know how to use them. So we get rid of Teslas and get Leafs. But we found out we didn't need 5 of them. We only needed 2 of them. And then we found out what they really wanted. As you say, they wanted e-bikes. They wanted e-bikes that they could access through the app, but they also wanted secure storage and charging for their own e-bikes and their scooters, rent scooters, their own scooters. And I guess some people may have had electric roller skates. Hell, I don't know. I'm 71 years old. But the point is, again, it's real-time data that can be taken, like William White had, from people in an exchange environment. We live in a capitalist system where people are going to vote with their wallets. And that if you can take that, now, this development of 87 units, we now have 1,200 units that are either built, that are in construction, that are in design, being to develop. What do? Well, we got retail in it now, but we've settled, we think, on our empirical data, we're only going to park at 0.35 per DU. And that's going to be for everything from the girlfriend that comes in from the hinterlands, North Carolina, to visit the boyfriend who lives there, or vice versa, or whatever. All these different combinations, we do need some parking. So we cannibalize the landscape for that first building, but at some point you catch up with your own behavior. So that's what we found out. Will it have expanded systems for the shared leasing of automobiles? Yes, absolutely. Will we serve as a mobility hub for a greater urban environment? Yes, absolutely. Some of these other projects Mark mentioned are what we're doing. And the other part about this, I just want to enter into the conversation, but all these things take place within a human dynamic, is that really what these things can do is engage in wealth distribution, but not in a way where you only think about it, Robin Hood, taking from the rich, giving to the poor. But within a person's own life, they can make sound, rational choices as to whether or not they want to spend $850 a month in owning an automobile, if you can believe AAA's numbers, or do you want to pay, like in the program Mark and I are working up, it's like $267 a month. Can you choose to put $400 a month back in your pocket and still have full-time access to an automobile? You can put the whole 850 in there, or maybe a little bit less if you say, I can live large on the landscape without having to depend upon that private automobile. Those are the big things. It goes back to Fordism. It goes back to setting up models whereby in this society of ours, people can make good choices with their own money to participate within the broader economy. Those are the things that are before us, I think, everyone. And because we live in a world where we think we'll spend huge amounts of money for low-income housing tax credits, for example, in order to save, in our market, $300 on a unit. Here you can do it as much or more through sound use with automobiles. Anyway,
Terry, I really like that framing of these technological advances enabling choice. I think we've had the ability to live however we want, as long as it's driving around and living in a single family home. And that doesn't necessarily meet everybody's needs. And with these advancements, we're really challenging the structures that have said that's the growth that we want to accommodate, and allowing people to make the trade-offs and figure out what works for them.
So on the other hand, as Terry and I we're interviewing a hospital system, it can be the difference on the developer side whether a project gets built or not. And I will say that we went into this meeting for a workforce housing project that otherwise would be very difficult to do. The developer, which is one of the 5 largest healthcare systems in the United States, was all for it. Then they pivoted and asked us, we have another multifamily project on the same site, this big campus. Any way you guys can bring your program to this developer, otherwise that won't get built. And so, again, I go back to, the community benefits of that, right? A denser core, less people on the street, a more mobility-centered development, and tax rolls that go up. And this is a project I think Terry's right, we'll have eventually 20,000 students, workers, and researchers. So, these are meaningful things that we're all talking about. And I think it's really fascinating. And so I will say that, yes, by focusing on our end, on the very secular side of, can we make real estate more efficient? And we're not thinking as much about autonomous vehicles off the road, but what we are doing is creating less traffic. And that is really important. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Yeah. So I want to give everybody an opportunity to offer some closing thoughts for both those gathered here today and the webcast on, what you see, what wisdom you would want to impart on the general public on understanding this connection between new mobility, automated vehicles, and real estate. Anybody want to jump in?
I can start. I haven't
Thanks,
really
Jonah.
heard one yet. This is a little bit off course, but I think it's so important, and I'd love to close with making sure that this thought gets into the into this incredible cloud of insights, which is that it came up. I think Nico was talking about in when we're talking about parcel delivery, this like incredible challenge no longer is the last mile, but really like that last 20 or that last 50 feet. This sort of like what we in our lab call the curb to kitchen problem. And one of the things that we've really come to understand recently as a knowledge gap in this whole space that affects all of these things quite dramatically is the degree to which we need to be thinking about mobility challenged users, people in wheelchairs, seeing impaired, hearing impaired, people who want to age in place. The connections between mobility challenged users and new mobility is something that is a kind of a blind spot for policy, a bit of a blind spot for planning, and a bit of a blind spot for design that is moving very, very quickly. Especially in the US, 1 out of 4 people is going to be over the age of 65 as of this year, and a huge percentage of those and others will also be facing mobility challenges and handicaps that make this space very challenging, in part because a lot of the protections that come from things like ADA and the Fair Housing Act and a lot of these other larger scale sort of policy frameworks are being challenged by these new mobility paradigms themselves. A very simple example is, parking minimums. We're seeing parking minimums go down or be dropped by municipal planning agencies altogether. This is somewhat exciting for us in the mobility space because it gives us a lot of opportunity to change the way cars connect to the urban fabric and our lifestyles. But it also, impacts the amount of handicap accessible parking that is also required. There are so many little ripple effects that I think are a really ripe space for us to be thinking about. And I think they will have dramatic effects both on land use and real estate as well, ultimately. So I know it's a little bit of a slight misalignment, but I do want to just maybe close out with that thought that I think that's really important space for us to also be embedding into these kinds of conversations.
Thank you, Jonah. Who'd like to go next?
I can jump in.
Go.
So I'd say the first thing, and I want to echo Jonah's discussion about this throughout, and Terry talked about this a little bit as well, that it's great to not only think about AVs, but shared mobility more broadly, right? Because I think there's a lot of different opportunities. AVs are going to give us some opportunities, but again, there's a lot of caveats in how they'll be deployed. There's a lot of options that exist right now with some of these other modes, which I think could have enormous impacts. I think Terry talked about that, already seeing projects that are saying, well, if I allow all these other, shared vehicles, TNCs, shared mobility, micromobility, these might actually have a whole lot of impacts on real estate in the near term, and I think they're more tangible and we're going to see them realized more easily. So that's one thing. Second thing I'll say is, as I've mentioned a couple times over this, there's a big difference between the imagining something that's possible and then it actually happening, right? And there's a whole lot of hurdles that need to be overcome to make that happen. On the one side, there's a technological part, fine, but there's a whole lot of other pieces that need to happen on the regulatory side or on the user uptake side, or to me, what's most important, and I keep on looking at, especially as we continue to have higher interest rates, is on the business model side, right? And so we need to be able to show that some of these things can work as actual functioning businesses. And to be more specific, what environments or what operating environments and what we'll say market environments they work the best at. So, having shared scooters in rural areas doesn't work so well, right? There is no model for that. Having AVs in rural areas, also there's we'll say more limited models for those things. In central cities, downtowns, well, that's where these things make a whole lot more sense. Some of these things make more sense. And then the last thing is just really trying to understand the cascading impacts around all these different. So, how does this, on the one hand, how might an AV or shared mobility affect parking? How might that affect land values? How might it affect real estate? How might that affect who has access to these things, as was being mentioned earlier, right? I think we need to think about these things broadly.
Mark?
So I'm just going to make it really simple. The future is now. I mean, this is not a self-serving comment, but we'll go live with the shared mobility hubs on a project we're doing with Terry in a continuing care retirement community where autonomous parking will be really important. And the future is now. It is going to be a really fun thing. We're going to learn a lot. We'll make a lot of mistakes along the way, but we will be, hopefully be very successful with this. Their phase 2 should save a significant amount of money that would otherwise maybe hinder the development of it in a high interest rate environment. And I think that it is a really great opportunity for us to reduce traffic, have greater asset intensity, and kind of create just a better environment around real estate generally and around land use in particular.
That's great you're doing that. I see a lot of opportunity for new mobility in the CCRC model.
Well, yeah, and I say the future is now. A lot of this stuff is possible at this moment. And I would just have to say that it's not us that developed a lot of the technology. You got to give credit to the OEMs with whom we work, and especially to Bosch, who has developed a lot of this kind of autonomous technology as a leader. And so, we're not there yet with all of it, but we start next week or next month, excuse me, and it will be a fun ride. And looking forward to aggregating the data.
Awesome. Terry, any parting thoughts?
Well, I hate that I wasn't able to participate in this. I mean, I feel hesitant in commenting much more. But one thing I would echo what Mark is saying. I think the future is now, and I'll just leave everyone who deals with the thinking about the future with an interesting story. There was a great architect in the 20th century, Louis Kahn, who was asked to be a part of a thinking about the future team with NASA. And somebody there was talking about going to Mars. And one of the guys there, the NASA engineers, held up a model, said, "This is the model of the rocket that will take us to Mars." And Louis Kahn just started laughing. And they said, all these great minds around the table said, "Well, why in the world? Why are you laughing?" He said, "You have no idea what the rocket will look like that will take us to Mars at this point in time. The future is always in the process of becoming." I'm paraphrasing the story, but it was a very humbling moment, I think, for many in the room. And I think that's where we all need to ground ourselves. And that's why I'm so glad to be working with Mark with some of the projects we're doing and together, because I encourage all of us to think about the now. Think about, the incremental change. Think about almost rapid prototyping in the built environment, because there's going to be a lot of things that are left by the wayside. Segway, I can mention one of those. I saw that first presentation by that guy years ago, and everybody said, everybody just go home and buy Segway stock now. So I mean, we're going to have all of these kinds of things, but not to lose sight again. It's the now, it's the people, and it's as an architect, the built environments which we make, because everything we're talking about serves the environments in which we as human beings make home, create.
Yeah, and it's fun to have conversations about the future based on our perspectives. But I want to remind everybody the COE is based in research, and our COE director, Joshi Ma, will share a little bit about what we're doing related to research.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. Thank you for the opportunity of closing the webinar. I think we're on time. I'll be very quick. So I really appreciate all the panelists and all the great questions actually from the audience. I think a lot of conversations today is really reinforces the importance of our work at the Mobility Center of Excellence. We took systems perspective. However, we're looking at it from a bottom-up approach from a lot of perspectives, because we want to understand the technology. My personal lab at UCLA does technology most of the work, but the center looking at how technology will have implications on cities. And regarding the congestion conversation we've been talking about, no matter micro thinking, or macro thinking, I think both are important. I always tell my students, transportation demand or mobility demand is a derived demand, right? It's really embedded in the land use, people's activities, and then becoming people really travel from location A to location B. So I always criticize that if you take today's transportation model to tell what the future is going to look like with automated vehicles, that's not going to happen, right? Don't even believe that. So I think the COE's role is really to identify all these issues, from micro thinking perspective, from micro thinking, we want to engage with the industry, we want to engage with academia, really to understand what's going to happen. And we also took a risk perspective as well. We have been working on different projects, understanding what are the risks, potential challenges to the systems, right? What are the unintended consequences that will be brought to the system while these new technologies are deployed in the system, so we can plan better for the future. So I will just stop here. I really thank you so much, all the panelists and audience. I encourage you all to stay connected with us through our website, our LinkedIn page. Please subscribe. And your feedback is very valuable to us. Please don't hesitate to contact us, and feel free to email me directly with all your suggestions. Any type of suggestion are extremely welcomed. Thank you again for your time and participation today. We look forward to seeing you on next webinar or future workshops.